He was the world's most feared soldier, known as Mr. War. But after being betrayed and left for dead by his own team, he wakes up in a new, weaker body on a desolate island. Now, trapped in a brutal world of slave miners and ruthless bosses, this former ghost of a soldier must fight to survive and uncover the truth behind his death. Can he escape this island of despair, or is he destined to become just another casualty in a system designed to crush the weak? This is the story of a soldier's rebirth and his relentless quest for revenge.
The Aldimir Republic Special Elite Unit was known across the world as Ghost. Feared by both soldiers and terrorist organizations alike, it was widely considered the most elite special forces unit in existence. Among its ranks stood a man renowned above all, George Sai, often referred to as the most powerful operative among them. His skill in battle was so brutal and effective that his name alone inspired fear. People around the globe had come to call him Mr. War, a title earned through relentless annihilation of his enemies. But on July 6, 2025, reports declared that George Sai had been killed in action. That night, at approximately 2 a.m., the Ghost Unit was mobilized to carry out a large-scale annihilation operation against a terrorist group known as Ignite. As their helicopter approached the enemy base, it began to experience heavy turbulence due to strong winds. The pilot informed the team that the original drop zone was no longer viable and suggested changing the insertion point. Captain Beck, leading the unit, immediately questioned the decision. He warned that altering the drop point would compromise the entire surprise assault. However, continuing as planned might risk the lives of half the squad. After a tense moment of silence, Beck ordered the mission to proceed as originally intended. Without waiting for further commands, George secured a rope inside the helicopter and hurled it downward. As he stood at the edge of the open door, Beck yelled at him, demanding to know what he was doing. George, calm and unbothered, replied that he was going down first and instructed the captain and the others to join him later from point B. Despite Beck's shouts for him to stop, George had already jumped, one hand gripping his gun, the other holding the rope. He landed gracefully on one knee, steady and composed. Beck then turned to the pilot and asked whether a retreat was still possible, but the pilot confirmed that the situation had advanced too far. Left with no other choice, Beck agreed to divert the squad to point B. He quietly muttered a desperate plea for George to stay alive. On the ground, George swiftly moved toward the enemy base's main gate. It was then that he noticed a sudden flash from an elevated position. A sniper had him in their sights. The sniper fired. George instantly dove behind a statue, narrowly dodging the shot. The bullet smashed into the statue's head. A second shot quickly followed, this one hitting the stone just inches from George's shoulder. Determined to fight back, George peeked out from behind cover and fired a series of precise shots. His aim was true. Bullets struck the sniper in the shoulder and head, and the enemy fell from the tower to the ground below. Just then, a terrorist managed to sneak up behind George, placing a pistol to the back of his head and ordering him not to move. George raised his hands in silent surrender. But in a flash of motion, he struck the man's arm with his elbow and delivered a swift kick that knocked him off balance. As he fell, George slipped behind him, wrapping his arm around the attacker's neck and snapping it with lethal precision. Before he could regroup, more terrorists appeared, opening fire in his direction. Thinking quickly, George lifted the corpse of the man he had just killed and used the body as a shield. Bullets tore through the air, hitting the corpse as George returned fire. The ambush was relentless, but George held his ground. He moved behind another statue, reloaded, and gunned down the attackers one by one with ruthless efficiency. As the last of them fell, George's radio crackled. Captain Beck was asking if he was all right. George said nothing. He simply turned the device off and moved toward the base's inner gate. Meanwhile, Captain Beck and the rest of the unit had landed at Point B. One soldier reported that all preparations were ready for breaching the entrance and inquired about George's status. Beck, clearly irritated, stated that there had been no response from him. In frustration, he muttered that George always seemed too eager to die. When the squad finally breached the mansion from their designated point, they were stunned by the sight that greeted them. George was already there. The situation had already been resolved. George reported that the mansion was secured and assigned the intel gathering task to the rest of the squad. Beck let out a long sigh, while the soldiers behind him looked around at the aftermath. Blood stained the floors, and terrorist corpses were strewn across the room. One soldier, visibly shaken, whispered that George Sy was still a monster, Mr. War through and through. Beck marched forward and grabbed George by the collar. He demanded to know why George had acted alone, shouting that soldiers who couldn't follow orders were a burden to the unit. George, unshaken, replied that the mission had been a success, so there shouldn't be a problem. He then added that had they forced the operation as initially planned, the entire unit would have been wiped out, and Beck knew it. Beck snapped, shouting at George to not talk back to him. The tension between them rose sharply until a soldier stepped in and reported that the commander-in-chief was calling for Captain Beck. As he turned to leave, Beck threw one last remark over his shoulder, calling George a rebellious brat. George responded that he wasn't rebelling out of pride. He had done it to repay Beck's favor and to achieve the objective. That was what mattered, killing the enemy and winning. His tone shifted as he clarified that it wasn't rebellion, but necessity. Beck paused briefly, wondering what George meant, then resumed walking away. As he climbed into a vehicle, he muttered under his breath, hoping George would die. Before departing, Beck addressed the squad, stating that he was heading to headquarters and that he expected them to follow the instructions he had left behind. The team nodded. George, confused, asked what instructions Beck had given. The entire squad suddenly turned their weapons on him. George stared in disbelief, demanding to know what was happening. One of the soldiers spoke up and said that they were sorry, but they were simply following Beck's orders. George's expression darkened as sweat began to bead on his face. His hand edged toward his pistol, and then a single bullet struck him in the forehead. Blood sprayed into the air. As George collapsed backwards, he tried to process what had happened. He now understood. Beck had planned his execution from the beginning. In that final moment, he recalled the gentle voice of a nurse named Sophia, who once had told him that he needed to come back alive. Then came a sound, sharp, piercing. George's eyes fluttered open. What he saw was horrifying. A skeletal corpse, leeches feasting on its rotting flesh. He gasped and shouted, claiming that it was the smell of death. When he sat up, he realized he was in the back of a truck, surrounded by corpses. Bandages wrapped parts of his face, arms, and body. He struggled to understand what was happening. He was sure he had died in the Ignite operation. Suddenly, the back doors opened and the corpses were thrown out into the river like trash. As George's body slipped toward the edge, he barely managed to grab the rim of the road and pulled himself to safety. Still on his knees, he exhaled heavily. It had been close. Looking toward the river, he saw countless corpses drifting in the current. The sight horrified him. The smell was unbearable. He muttered about the sheer number of the dead and how advanced their decay was. Eagles circled above, feasting on the bodies. He asked himself aloud if he had reached the front lines of the bizarre district. Inside the truck, an old man grumbled that cleaning up trash this early in the morning was a mess. The driver responded by telling him to think of it as feeding the fish in Tokyo Bay. The vehicle rolled away as George stood by the edge, the salty wind tearing away the last of his bandages. In the reflection of the water, he saw his face, now younger, marred with scratches and bruises. As he listened to the departing truck's conversation, he suddenly realized something. Tokyo Bay? That could only mean one thing. He had reached Japan, his homeland. And so, on July 6th, 2025, the world believed George Sai had died. But in truth, he had been reborn on an island of desperation.
George stood in silence, questioning where he had ended up. Just moments ago, he had been in the Middle East, but now he found himself in Tokyo Bay, Japan, with no explanation for the sudden change. The only clue was the garbage truck that had just driven off into the distance. He watched it quietly, his expression unreadable. Later, George was seen running through a thick jungle. Despite only covering a short distance, he quickly became winded and found it difficult to breathe. He began to wonder what had happened to his body. It felt far too weak for someone who had once been a powerful soldier. Realizing that survival was now his priority, he decided to search for food and water. He broke open a bamboo stalk and drank from it while sitting on the branch of a tall tree. The moment reminded him of a past mission where he had once been separated from his teammates in a jungle just like this. Soon after, George noticed a town in the distance. As he approached, he realized it was unfamiliar. The streets were in disarray, with garbage scattered everywhere. Elderly people worked along the sidewalks in silence, and the place felt run down and forgotten. George assumed it must be somewhere near Tokyo Bay, but the conditions confused him. When he stepped on an empty can and looked down, he saw piles of trash beneath his feet. He found it hard to believe such a slum existed in Japan. What shocked him most was when he saw his own reflection in a broken mirror nearby. The face that stared back at him was not his own. It was someone else entirely. He was unable to process what he was seeing and questioned if he had become a different person. While he was frozen in place, staring at the mirror, a hand suddenly grabbed his shoulder. A voice behind him called out the name Michio. George reacted instantly, moving on reflex. He spun around, grabbed the person behind him, and struck them in the neck. The boy yelped in shock and shouted that it was him, Masa. George paused and studied him. He didn't recognize the name, but the boy didn't seem to be carrying any weapons. Upon further observation, George realized that in this new body, he might be known as Michio. He asked Masa if he knew him and what he wanted. Masa, still shaken, asked why he had attacked him so suddenly. He insisted that he had only called out to his friend. After a moment, George apologized and offered his hand. Masa took it and pulled himself off the ground. Masa admitted that he was relieved to see him safe. He explained that he had been worried since Michio, George's current identity, was constantly getting beaten up. George was surprised and asked why that was the case. Masa told him it was because in the mining area, Zeha's word was absolute, and that was the reason behind all the abuse. Just then, a voice from behind interrupted the conversation. Zeha, a man with braided hair, had overheard Masa and asked if he had just called him by name. Masa froze in fear while George remained still and calm. Zeha clenched his fist and approached them, accusing Masa of disrespect. He reminded him that a slave miner had no right to address him without honorifics and declared that this called for a penalty. Without warning, Zeha lunged at Masa and punched him hard, sending him crashing into a wall. George stayed where he was, watching. Zeha walked over and grabbed Masa by the hair.
As Masa screamed in pain, Zeha recited the rules again, that if someone missed an order, it was a penalty, and if they annoyed him, that too was a penalty. Masa, panicked, cried out that he wasn't the one who had used Zeha's name. He pointed to Michio, claiming it was him who had done it. He said he had only followed Michio's lead. Zeha turned toward George, eyes narrowing. He released Masa and stepped forward. He commented that it was surprising Michio had survived the beatings he had received. He smirked darkly, locking eyes with George. He asked what was wrong with Michio's eyes, and noticing his calm expression, mocked him by saying it looked like he hadn't been beaten enough. George remained silent. Zeha moved closer until their faces were inches apart. He told him that his cocky look had earned him another penalty. Then, he threw a punch straight at George's face. George, however, dodged it easily. From the movement alone, he could already tell that Zeha was nothing more than an amateur. Zeha, startled, attempted another strike. George dodged that one too. He muttered that he had no interest in fighting civilians, but if Zeha insisted on attacking, he would take over from here. His eyes burned with a cold determination. He slipped beneath Zeha's next punch and countered with a powerful strike to the face. Zeha took the hit but stayed on his feet, his face contorted with fury. George clenched his fist, analyzing the exchange. He had landed a solid counter, but Zeha hadn't gone down. That meant this new body was weaker than he had thought. Moving in again, George dodged another attack and launched himself at Zeha. He believed that even with a weakened frame, an elbow strike should have enough force. He delivered the blow cleanly to Zeha's face. Blood spurted from Zeha's mouth as he dropped to his knees, clutching his face. George stood over him and coldly stated that it was impossible for Zeha to subdue him. He advised him to take his petty fights elsewhere, unless he had a death wish. Turning around, George began to walk away. Behind him, Zeha growled and slipped his hand into his pocket. He snarled that George was underestimating him. Pulling out a knife, he reminded George that anyone who had ever hit him back had received a 100 penalty. Face twisted with rage, Zeha lunged forward with the blade aimed at George. George began to turn, but before the knife could strike, a small child leapt in, shoving George aside and placing himself directly in the path of the incoming blade.
Despite the child standing directly in front of him, Zeha didn't halt his attack. The knife in his hand came dangerously close, just an inch away, before it abruptly stopped. George had stepped in. He dropped low, rose swiftly, and blocked Zeha's arm, meeting him head-on. His expression turned cold, and Zeha, seeing the sudden shift in his demeanor, was visibly afraid. George, gritting his teeth in anger and widening his eyes, asked if Zeha, now that he had drawn a blade, was prepared to kill or be killed. A faint blue aura ignited in George's eyes as he reached for Zeha's neck with sharp precision. He pinched his fingers against his throat, kicked Zeha's leg to knock off his balance, and landed a clean punch that hurled him to the ground. The child nearby could only watch, stunned and speechless. Zeha lay on the floor, brutally beaten. George stepped forward, seized him by the collar, and raised his fist again, blue energy swirling around it. Though Zeha shouted for him to stop, George's eyes glinted coldly as he stated that in a fight to the death, there was no such thing as wait, and struck him again. The child remained frozen in shock. Blood covered George's fist, and Zeha was unconscious, blood spilling from his nose. As George stood and examined his hand, he quietly wondered how, even with all his weight behind the blow, the damage had been so limited. He realized his new body was far weaker than the one he once had. Suddenly, the child cried out, demanding to know what was happening, and called George by the name of Michio. George turned his head slightly and asked what had happened to the boy who used to be close to Michio. The child shouted, believing Michio was simply playing around,
but George calmly told him the truth. He had amnesia. He explained it was a memory loss caused by brain damage or disease, and the extent of damage determined whether the loss was partial or complete. The boy was silenced by the answer, staring at George in disbelief. He then pointed to himself and introduced his name as Kyo, the boy who lived next door. But George, walking away with a cold expression, told him that he didn't even remember his name. Kyo was stunned, unable to process the words. He ran after George, asking if he truly didn't remember him either. As they walked together through the streets, Zeha slowly regained consciousness behind them. His rage returned, and with bloodshot eyes, he screamed that George would now receive a super penalty. Kyo, walking beside George, excitedly commented on how strong he had been during the fight and eagerly asked him to teach him how to fight as well. But George ignored the request and instead asked Kyo to explain what this island was. Realizing George was serious, Kyo grinned slightly and began to explain. He told him that the island was an industrial waste dump floating in Tokyo Bay, essentially a garbage heap teeming with filth. George's expression dimmed, wondering how a place like this could even exist in Japan. Kyo elaborated that men were forced to work in the mines, while women and children survived by selling scraps or scavenging through the trash. He added that the island's security was just as bad as it looked, calling it a giant toilet pit. George silently compared it to the slums of a war-torn country, perhaps even worse. Eventually, they reached a small food store. Kyo stared longingly at a loaf of bread, while George stood quietly behind him. The shop owner appeared and immediately told Kyo that he couldn't have it, dismissing him harshly. Kyo, visibly upset, shouted back in protest. Without saying much, George stepped forward, placed money on the counter, and asked for the bread. The owner accepted the money and handed over the loaf. Kyo was surprised, asking if the bread was for him. George told him it was a gesture of thanks for sharing information about the island earlier. Kyo's face lit up with joy. He thanked George repeatedly, overwhelmed with gratitude. Curious, he asked where the money had come from. George explained that he had taken it from Zeha's pocket after the fight. He added that while he wouldn't stoop to robbing dead soldiers, in a place like this, money was essential. Kyo looked at him with teary eyes and said that Michio was now a completely different person. Soon they reached home. Kyo knocked at the door, calling out that he was back. Once inside, he ran to his mother, who lay weak and ill on the bed. He proudly held up the bread, declaring that tonight they were having a feast. Michio had bought everything. She smiled faintly and invited him to eat with her. But Kyo shook his head, lying that he had already eaten, even though he hadn't. She asked again if he truly had, and he insisted she shouldn't worry about him. She needed to eat and regain her strength. George stood nearby, observing the scene silently. Then something clicked in his mind. His eyes sharpened. Without warning, he turned and slammed into the front door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Moments later, the house was engulfed in fire. Kyo and his mother screamed in terror as smoke poured in. Outside, Zeha stood watching with a malicious grin. He was accompanied by several mining workers, all of whom had helped set the house on fire. Zeha's eyes glowed darkly, and with twisted glee, he licked the edge of his blade. He declared that George's penalty for hitting him was death.
The fire had begun to rage, spreading fast as smoke curled through the air. Kyo, overwhelmed by the sudden chaos, had stared at the flames in disbelief and panic, wondering aloud why a fire had erupted in their home. Inside, George, standing with sharp focus amidst the smoke, quickly assessed the situation. He had realized immediately that the fire wasn't an accident, it was a trap. The door had been locked from the outside. They were being ambushed. Listening closely, George had estimated from the synchronized footsteps outside that there were at least 9 attackers waiting for them. Calculating the threat, he knew he had to act quickly. Instead of panicking, he immediately began scanning the small, worn-down room for anything he could turn into a weapon. His instincts told him that there had to be something, anything they could use. His eyes finally landed on a bag-like object tied with rope, hanging loosely from above. He moved swiftly, grabbing the bag and examining it. It was crude, but it would do. Securing it tightly in his grip, he got up and rushed toward the door. Kyo, confused by his movements, had called out to him, asking in alarm what he was trying to do. But George didn't respond. Instead, he charged at the door with brute force and slammed his foot into it. The door exploded outward, splintering, as 2 of the attackers standing just outside were sent flying from the impact. Smoke billowed out behind George as he stood at the threshold, his silhouette surrounded by flames. Outside, several other armed attackers were waiting, standing confidently behind Zeha. They wore smug, cruel grins. Zeha himself stepped forward, his lips curled into a twisted smile. He had mocked George, saying that stepping out was a stupid move. Without hesitation, Zeha commanded his men to surround George from all sides. George stood still, tall and unwavering. His eyes glinted with cold fire. He calmly questioned Zeha's motives, asking why he had come back after being beaten so thoroughly earlier. What did he want now? Zeha's grin widened, revealing broken teeth. His aura had turned vicious, pulsing red with fury. Clutching the blade in his hand, Zeha announced with rage that George would be sentenced to death for the crime of pissing him off, for the crime of injuring him, and for the simple crime of not submitting. His voice trembled with fury as he declared that this was George's final penalty. George stood silently, his expression unchanging. He responded flatly, declaring that from this moment onward, the hostile threat would be completely eliminated. Their eyes locked. The tension thickened. Meanwhile, just behind them, Kyo had managed to drag his coughing mother out of the burning house. Both of them were gasping for breath as they collapsed on the ground. Kyo turned to check on George and saw him drop into a low stance, preparing for combat. George, turning his head just slightly, told Kyo to run when he saw an opening. Kyo, terrified, nodded silently. One of the attackers yelled as he rushed forward, saying he wouldn't let George escape. But George had already gripped a stone in his palm with firm control. Just as the attacker came within a few feet, blade raised high, George hurled the stone with deadly precision. It struck the attacker squarely in the head, dropping him instantly to the ground. The impact left a clear, brutal mark on his skull. Kyo and George both stared, stunned. George stood over the fallen body, lifting the bag in his hand. It was now clear. He had fashioned it into a blackjack, a makeshift but highly lethal weapon made by filling cloth with stones. He explained, mostly to himself, that it was a favored weapon among elite assassins. Though it appeared simple, when spun to build momentum and slammed into a target, it was capable of delivering terrifying damage. It was specifically designed to disable human targets in a single, decisive blow. Spinning the blackjack with mechanical precision, George lunged at the rest of the attackers. They rushed toward him with weapons raised, but George moved faster. He struck them down one after another. Each hit was clean, calculated, and effective. Blood spattered the ground. Chaos erupted. Zeha's eyes went wide. He was unable to process what he was witnessing. One by one, all of his men fell to the ground, defeated and groaning in pain. George stood amidst them like a storm that had passed through. George, still gripping the blackjack, then turned his eyes toward Zeha and muttered coldly that he was the last one left. Paralyzed with fear, Zeha couldn't speak. He thought George had to be joking. But then, fueled by rage and humiliation, Zeha screamed and charged at George with his blade. George didn't flinch.
As Zeha came close, he delivered a devastating blow to his arm with the blackjack, breaking it instantly. Zeha howled in pain as his weapon clattered to the ground. He dropped to his knees, clutching his shattered limb. George began advancing toward him. Zeha looked up, terror overtaking his features. His eyes locked on the blackjack still spinning in George's grip. Begging for mercy, Zeha pleaded for George to stop, claiming there was no need for further punishment. But George's voice was cold, almost mechanical, as he replied that anyone who threatened his life needed to be completely eliminated. As George raised the blackjack for the final strike, Zeha closed his eyes in fear. At that very moment, Kyo leapt forward and grabbed George's arm, yelling for him to stop. Tears rolled down Kyo's cheeks as he begged George not to kill him. He insisted that no matter how strong someone was, killing was wrong. Kyo pleaded for him not to become a murderer. George's grip loosened. He let out a deep sigh and slowly lowered the weapon. Zeha didn't wait. He scrambled to his feet and fled for his life. George reared back, as if to throw the blackjack at Zeha's back, but Kyo held him tightly again, begging him not to. He threw it anyway, but it missed Zeha, striking a steel post nearby. Zeha glanced once, then disappeared into the shadows. Kyo exhaled in relief and thanked George for stopping. George stood beside him, silently watching Zeha vanish. He muttered quietly, almost to himself, questioning the word murderer. Later that night, under the pale moon, a warehouse stood in silence. Its doors were shut tightly. Inside, Zeha was on his knees, bloodied and humiliated. He was pleading before a large, imposing man sitting casually on a worn-out sofa. He had golden hair and a massive frame. Zeha, sniveling, told the man that George had hit him. He swung a weapon like a lunatic, and in his words, George was totally insane. He begged the man to punish George. The golden-haired man slowly stood up and agreed aloud that such behavior was truly unforgivable. Zeha smiled, thinking justice was on his side at last. But suddenly, the man threw a brutal punch into Zeha's face, breaking his nose instantly. Blood streamed from Zeha's mouth and nostrils. Another enforcer standing nearby scoffed and asked, how could a site supervisor lose to a slave miner? He called it pathetic. Before Zeha could recover, the blond man clenched his fists, decorated with heavy rings, and delivered a second punishing blow. Blood sprayed through the air as Zeha collapsed, whimpering. A dog standing beside the man calmly licked the blood off his master's fist, as if this was all routine. The man then turned, his golden aura radiating power. Clenching his fists again, he muttered that George might just be worth punching a few more times. Later that night, under the soft glow of the moonlight, Michio's, once George, house sat quiet and dim. Inside, Kyo's mother lay resting on a mat, her illness heavily weighing on her frail body. George was nearby, quietly assembling what appeared to be a weapon. His focus didn't break as he methodically worked on constructing a bow. Kyo, after finishing up a few chores, sighed aloud in frustration. He walked over to the burnt remnants of their former shelter and muttered to himself that this was seriously the worst. He'd put so much effort into building that place, and now in the blink of an eye, it had all been reduced to ashes. He didn't know what he was supposed to do anymore. Inside the room, his mother slowly sat up and asked George if he was really okay with letting them stay at his home. George nodded in agreement, though it wasn't out of pure charity. He had allowed them to stay in his house under a condition. In return, they had to provide him with complete information about the island, how it was managed, how food was supplied, and any other key insights they had. As he tightened the final string of the bow, he stated calmly, he wanted to know everything. Kyo overheard the conversation and clenched his fists in frustration. Then he turned to George and demanded that he stop talking to him like a stranger. He exclaimed that since George had lost his memory, he'd been acting completely different. He questioned aloud whether George's entire personality had changed. George didn't respond right away. Kyo's words had struck something inside him. He reflected silently that the kid might be right. He was a different person now. Flashes of memory crossed his mind. He recalled his past self, a soldier betrayed and executed by his own allies on the battlefield. It hadn't been a mistake. There was someone higher up who had orchestrated it.
His eyes grew darker with resolve as he silently vowed not to let things end that way again. He would escape this island, and when he did, he would track down and eliminate every last one of those traitors. The next morning, George took his training outside. He dropped down to the ground and began trying to rebuild his physical strength. Supporting his full weight with just his arms, he pushed himself up for a single push-up, his muscles trembling from the effort. Sweat dripped from his brow as he struggled through the movement. By the second push, his body collapsed. He cursed under his breath, wondering if this was all the strength this body had to offer. He realized that his muscles and core strength had completely deteriorated. He'd have to rebuild everything from the ground up. As he was recovering, he heard someone call out to him. Turning his head, he saw Masa jogging toward him, panting hard. George recognized him instantly. He was the same boy who had shifted blame during the Zeha incident. Masa, still catching his breath, asked George what he was doing and warned that he'd be late for the mine. George paused for a moment, then decided internally that going to the mine might actually be a good opportunity to gather intel on the island's internal operations. Later, in the depths of the underground mine, the workers were ordered to line up. George took his place among them. As he glanced around, he noticed a few of Zeha's old subordinates, bandaged, bruised, and visibly afraid at the sight of him. He recognized them as Zeha's lackeys, and quietly noted that they still hadn't recovered from their last encounter. The supervisor stepped forward and announced that there was urgent news. Zeha, the supervisor in charge of Team G, was dead. Most of the workers gasped in disbelief, but George stood still, unfazed by the news. The supervisor continued by stating that a replacement was needed. He pointed directly at Masa, number 8 from Team G, and informed him that he would be taking Zeha's place. Masa appeared stunned and unable to comprehend what he had just heard. The workers then dispersed and returned to their duties. The mines were brutal. Slave miners were forced to work from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m., performing exhausting physical labor under inhumane conditions. The tunnels were dark, oppressive, and filled with the stench of sweat and suffering. It was exploitation in its purest form. Suddenly, a shout echoed through the shaft. A man was berating a worker, kicking him repeatedly while laughing and accusing him of slowing down the team. The others looked on helplessly, afraid to intervene. Masa stepped in quietly. He placed a comforting hand on a frightened laborer and reassuring him that things were different under his supervision. He promised not to hit anyone and encouraged them all to work at their own pace. Tears welled up in the eyes of one worker, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. Masa then approached the worker who had just been beaten. Placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, he told him to rest. The man nodded in gratitude, while George watched the scene unfold silently from a distance. The peace was short-lived. The bully returned with a smirk, mocking Masa's leniency. He shoved Masa to the ground and snarled that he hated people who pretended to be soft. Then, turning back to the injured worker, he threatened to teach him discipline. Before he could act, a pickaxe grazed his leg, causing him to wince. He looked down in confusion, then turned to see George standing a few steps away. George apologized sarcastically, claiming that his hand had slipped. The bully approached George, standing face to face with him and demanding to know what his problem was. George remained calm, unfazed by the threat. He leaned in and growled that he might be the one who needed a lesson. At that moment, a third presence entered the scene. A figure with golden blonde hair and a powerful build stepped forward. His aura radiated authority and menace. It was Kusanagi. A smirk played on his lips as he said he liked what he was seeing and declared that if there was a fight, he wanted in. The other workers froze in fear. Someone whispered Kusanagi's name, and another remarked that the man was doomed.
The bully immediately tried to backtrack, stammering that he hadn't meant anything by it and would never dare to fight Kusanagi. But Kusanagi wasn't interested in apologies. His expression darkened, his fists clenched. He shouted that if the man wasn't going to listen, then he should drop dead. With a burst of speed, Kusanagi lunged forward and delivered a crushing punch to the bully's face. The man collapsed instantly, unconscious from a single, precise blow. Gasps erupted from the bystanders. George, still standing nearby, observed the technique. He realized that Kusanagi hadn't just hit with force. He had struck a pressure point perfectly, knocking him out with scientific precision. Kusanagi, grinning as he flexed his fist, turned toward the others and asked who was next. Then his eyes locked on George. He asked George if he wanted to fight. George's voice remained calm as he replied that he didn't fight without a reason. Masa quickly intervened, reminding George, now Michio, to be respectful. And the moment Kusanagi heard the name Michio, something inside him ignited. His aura surged and blazed around him. His expression twisted with fury. He had been waiting for this. Without warning, Kusanagi lunged toward George. George didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed, and he took a defensive stance, ready for the inevitable clash.
Kusanagi had charged at George with fierce speed, his fists swinging to land a decisive blow. But George had anticipated the attack and brought his guard up just in time. As Kusanagi reached him, he unleashed a rapid flurry of punches, each aimed with deadly precision. George, however, stood his ground and blocked the blows with both arms raised, his head lowered in focus. The surrounding workers stood frozen in awe, unable to believe the sheer speed and power Kusanagi displayed. Masa, watching helplessly, feared that Michio, George, might not survive the onslaught. George appeared to be nearing his limits, straining under the barrage of relentless strikes. Kusanagi's punches were not only fast and heavy, but alarmingly accurate. Everything about his attack was top class. But George wasn't just enduring it. He was analyzing. He narrowed his eyes and carefully studied Kusanagi's rhythm. He noticed that with each wide swing, Kusanagi exposed a vulnerable opening as he pulled his arm back too far. Recognizing the opportunity, George shifted his stance. With precise footwork, he dodged to the side and slipped past Kusanagi's latest punch. Their eyes locked for a split second, Kusanagi startled to see George escaping his barrage so cleanly. Without hesitation, George dropped his weight and launched a punch aimed directly at Kusanagi's face, putting all of his strength behind it. Gasps rose from the workers. For a moment, they were stunned. Was George really about to land a clean hit on Kusanagi? But just before impact, Kusanagi's hand shot up. He caught George's punch mid-air and grinned. He admitted it was a decent attempt, clearly impressed and increasingly fired up. Kusanagi shouted that this was getting fun, inviting George to fight until they beat each other senseless. Before another strike could be thrown, a stern voice cut through the tension. Someone had shouted at them to quiet down. Everyone turned to look, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. All the workers dropped their knees in a panic. Kusanagi and George followed their gaze. A tall figure had entered the mine tunnel, flanked by two silent bodyguards. The man approached with an intimidating calmness. It was Director Akechi. As Akechi walked through, workers bowed down on either side. He moved with cold precision, adjusting his glasses with a subtle flick of his fingers. His expression was sharp, unreadable. George, observing him quietly, recognized the authority the man carried. This was the one in charge. Akechi stopped and called out to Kusanagi. The fighter was visibly surprised by his presence. Akechi warned Kusanagi not to break the slaves over trivial fights. If it happened again, he said, he'd report the matter directly to the blood-packed Marquise. Kusanagi's face stiffened with fear. His eyes widened. Trying to smooth things over, he forced a smile and insisted that it wasn't a real fight, just some educational guidance for the workers. But Akechi wasn't buying it. As he passed Kusanagi, he sneered and mocked him. He said that calling it guidance was laughable when all Kusanagi knew how to do was punch. He added coldly that no one expected brains from a meathead like him. Kusanagi stood frozen in place, his expression darkening with frustration. He clenched his fists, but dared not respond. Akechi then approached the kneeling workers. His tone turned even harsher as he asked them why they were bowing. He demanded to know if that was part of their job. His expression darkened as he issued a chilling order. They were to work until they dropped, unless they wanted to be scrapped like garbage. Masa, still kneeling, broke into a cold sweat. Fear had gripped the air.
And at 2 p.m., the lunch break arrived. George sat down with his meal, a bland, cold plate that barely qualified as food. The other workers around him had already eaten, but they remained hungry. One of them murmured about how the site supervisors ate like kings, dreaming of one day tasting a proper lunchbox. Hunger gnawed at them. One of the men was so weak he fell to the ground, growling in frustration. Just then, Masa approached George and offered his lunch to him. George hesitated, then declined. He said he didn't want it. Masa pressed him, asking why not. George replied that he didn't want to owe anyone anything. He continued eating his own flavorless meal. Masa took a seat beside him and explained that it wasn't about owing a favor. He said he just wanted to repay George for what had happened earlier, when he had dragged him into a mess during the fight with Zeha and had blamed him unjustly. He admitted that he had acted like a coward. Masa extended the meal once again and said he didn't want things to end on that note. This small act, he said, was the least he could do. George listened and eventually smiled. He chuckled and picked up a single piece of karage from the box. He told Masa that for one lie, one piece of karage was fair. As he bit into it, he savored the taste and told Masa to hurry and eat the rest. They were even now. Masa looked at him in disbelief, humbled by the gesture. Before they could exchange more words, 2 other workers rushed over and excitedly shoved each other, pleading with Masa to give them some of the leftover meal. Masa was caught off guard by how desperate they were. He laughed nervously and told them to only take 1 piece each. They exclaimed that he was the best boss ever. But the moment of lightness was shattered. A guard stormed in and began cursing at the workers. He berated them, calling them slaves, and demanded to know how long they planned to sit there and eat. Everyone froze. His eyes narrowed as he shouted for them to get back to work. Inside the mine, the reality was grim. The slave miners were subjected to relentless physical labor. They had no rights, no dignity, only suffering. As one of the workers staggered down a corridor, his strength gave out. He collapsed to the floor. Masa rushed to his side in a panic, shouting and shaking him to wake up. But there was no response. A guard approached and coldly ordered Masa to move aside. Masa looked up in confusion. The guard stepped forward, kicked the body, and rolled him over. After a quick check, he announced that the worker was dead. Masa was horrified. The guard barked at the group, yelling, "Group G, that one's yours. Dump him up top." The others nodded solemnly and prepared to move the body. Masa turned away, trembling. His back toward George, he choked back tears and whispered for Michio not to push himself too hard. Then the tears fell freely. He gritted his teeth in silence. George said nothing. The work didn't stop. Another guard approached George and Masa and ordered them to get back to digging. The others lifted the corpse onto a stretcher, carrying it like trash. The guard muttered that a mere death didn't stop the work. And inside that underground hell, it was true. A human life meant less than garbage. The workers carried on, their spirits dimmed.
George stood motionless, his expression darkening. He didn't say a word, but inside, fury continued to rise.
A few hours later, the instructor rang the bell and informed the workers that their shift was over, instructing them to put down their tools. Masa's body was trembling. He was at his absolute limit. Letting out a shaky sigh, he felt a wave of relief wash over him as the bell echoed through the mines. Just then, his gaze fell upon George. To his surprise, George was still standing tall and firm, as if unaffected by the strain. Masa couldn't help but wonder how George was able to stand like that after such intense labor and even a fight. When he asked, George calmly responded that he was used to this level of strain. Masa's eyes widened in shock. He questioned internally whether Michio had always been this tough. Soon after, the instructor shouted at Group G, demanding they stop dragging their feet. Masa quickly nodded in response, pulling himself together. Once mining ended, the workers were forced to strip completely and made to walk stark naked in their utterly exhausted state. As they ascended the stairs slowly, lacking even the strength to lift their legs properly, the instructor yelled at them to move faster. After reaching the upper level, they were subjected to full-body inspections to prevent ore theft. Only once that degrading process was complete were they finally allowed to return to the surface. Upon emerging from the mine, the workers assembled in a line as instructed, standing at attention before the superior. It was now Team G9's turn to get paid. One by one, the workers received their wages. George, too, was handed his share, 1,000 yen for 16 hours of grueling labor. One of the workers, upon receiving his pay, thanked the superior enthusiastically. He appeared genuinely happy, saying that money always made him feel better. George watched him with disbelief. He couldn't understand how someone could look that happy after receiving such a pitiful amount. Suddenly, the sound of rolling wheels approached. A cart was coming. The workers lit up with excitement. George looked around, puzzled, as the others murmured joyfully among themselves. He wondered what was happening. It turned out to be a food cart named Smiley Sale. A cheerful girl stepped out from it and thanked the workers for their hard work. Another woman standing beside her called out that it was time for the Smiley Sale. The girl then announced that since the workers had put in a hard day's labor, it was Mining Appreciation Day, and everything was 20% off. George, still confused, quietly asked himself what Mining Appreciation Day was. The workers didn't hesitate. They rushed toward the cart, eager to buy their favorite foods at a discounted price. The cart attendants even handed out some snacks for free, further lifting the workers' spirits. Soon, the area around the cart was filled with customers. Smiles returned to their tired faces. One man cracked open a can of beer, exclaiming how much he loved it, that it activated every cell in his body. Another man, who had spent his entire daily wage, 1,000 yen, on food, sat contentedly with a meal of nuts and beer, satisfied just to fill his belly. George silently observed it all, thinking how strange the shift in tone was. Just moments ago, these men were being treated like slaves, and now they were laughing and cheering like children. Masa suddenly approached from behind and remarked that it must be nice for everyone. George turned to him and asked why he wasn't buying anything. Masa smiled sheepishly and replied that he wanted to, but he had sworn not to spend a single yen until he had saved enough to buy the Paraiso Pass. George looked at him curiously and asked what the Paraiso Pass was. Masa was surprised by the question. He reminded George that they were told about it on their very first day. He began recalling the day a man had addressed all the new arrivals, saying that from that moment onward, they were slaves crawling in the dirt, forced to work beyond their limits and given barely enough food to survive. They would live worse than livestock. But even in such hell, the man had told them, money talks. If anyone wanted a way out, they needed to save up 1 million yen. That would buy them a Paraiso Pass, a guaranteed ticket to freedom off the island. Masa explained that everyone had been thrilled upon hearing that there was a way out. They'd all become determined to save that amount, no matter how many beatings or how much exhaustion they endured. From that moment, Masa had made a decision. No matter how many times he was kicked around, no matter how close he came to collapsing, he would not spend a single yen until he reached that goal. As George listened, he began to understand the system. He thought to himself that even under such hellish conditions, there was no rebellion because 2 carrots were always dangling in front of them. One was hope, the promise of the Paraiso Pass, the dream of leading the island and reclaiming their stolen rights. The other was pleasure, fleeting satisfaction from food and drink that made them forget their suffering. George realized then that the mining staff and the powerful people backing them knew this all too well. They manipulated the workers with it. His expression turned grim as he understood how sickening the system truly was. Without a word, George pulled out his crumpled pay and looked at it. Then, stepping toward Masa, he asked him how much more he needed to buy the Paraiso Pass. Masa was taken aback by the question. He didn't understand why George wanted to know and hesitated to answer. George reassured him, telling him to relax, and promised he wouldn't leak the information. Then he held out his pay and said he wanted to help Masa escape. Masa, still in disbelief, finally admitted that he only had 940,000 yen. He needed 60,000 more to reach 1 million. George quickly calculated that if the 2 of them worked together and saved both their wages, they could make 2,000 yen per day. It would take exactly 30 more days for Masa to reach his goal. Masa appreciated George's concern, but remained puzzled, asking why George was willing to go so far for him. Standing at the edge of a steep mountain cliff, George replied that he wasn't doing it for Masa, he was doing it for himself. Looking down at the churning river far below, George then asked if there were any boats or docks on the island. Masa shook his head and told him there weren't. The river was surrounded by cliffs, he could see for himself. He explained that the whole island was ringed by sheer cliffs, and added flatly that it was just common sense. George exhaled quietly. Then, without saying anything more, he began to climb down the cliffside. Startled, Masa yelled at him to stop, shouting that he'd become insane. But George simply looked back and asked, "There are laws in this lawless zone?" Just then, a sound broke through the air, low and mechanical. A flying drone buzzed toward him, hovering overhead. It was equipped with a mounted gun and a surveillance camera. George recognized it immediately. It was military grade. He stared at it in silence, stunned by the realization. They were being watched.
A moment later, the drone detected motion and locked onto its targets. Its internal system confirmed. Tracking initiated. Target acquired. Meanwhile, George was struggling to climb back up the cliff. Masa, still standing near the edge, was frozen in shock as he stared at the drone. He couldn't comprehend what he was seeing and wondered aloud what that thing even was. Just as George managed to pull himself back onto the cliff, he yelled at Masa to run. Masa, startled and panicked, didn't understand why George was shouting at him. Then, without warning, a bullet fired past his face, grazing it just enough to send him into stunned silence. The close call snapped him back to reality, and both men took off running. As they sprinted, Masa demanded to know what was going on and what the drone was. George didn't bother explaining. He just shouted at him to shut up and keep moving, the urgency in his voice leaving no room for debate. The drone began firing again, but the 2 barely managed to stay ahead of its barrage. While running, George glanced behind and observed the drone's pattern. He recognized it instantly. It was the SG Nemesis 1.0, a military-grade model designed to pursue and eliminate targets that moved within its detection range. He knew once it had locked onto someone, it wouldn't stop until the target was dead. He recalled that the SG Nemesis 1.0 had earned a terrifying nickname among soldiers, Crazy Chaser, the Mad Pursuer. It was known as a merciless weapon of slaughter that had even caused experienced veterans to tremble.
The drone's gunfire rained down behind them as Masa screamed again, unable to comprehend what was happening. George, while still running, suddenly changed direction and ordered Masa to follow him. Masa, trying to warn him that the path ahead was a dead end, but George insisted they go for it anyway. The two of them plunged into the bushes and kept running as hard as they could. The drone followed relentlessly, maneuvering through trees and adjusting its altitude and angle with incredible precision. George noted just how specialized and advanced its tracking capabilities were. It could adapt mid-flight, weaving through the forest like a mechanical predator. George glanced over his shoulder at Masa, who was visibly slowing down. He warned him that if he didn't pick up the pace, he'd fall behind and get killed. Masa, struggling to breathe, admitted that he couldn't run anymore, but George refused to accept that. He shouted at him to keep moving or die. Analyzing the situation quickly, George knew they wouldn't last long like this. Then, he noticed a rat climbing a nearby tree. An idea sparked. Without hesitation, he grabbed the rat mid-stride. He told Masa he would count down from 3, and when he hit 0, Masa had to stop and not move an inch. Masa, panicking, questioned what George was planning and insisted he'd be riddled with bullets. George ignored him and began the countdown. 3. Masa pleaded with him to stop and think it through. 2. As George leapt over a log, dodging bullets, the drone still closing in, he continued, 1. Masa screamed, certain this was the end. George apologized softly to the rat, then said 0, and threw it directly towards the drone. The drone's sensors beeped, registering a new moving target. Its targeting system switched immediately. The rat, now airborne, became the focus. Target updated. Firing. A single burst from the drone obliterated the rat. At that exact moment, George and Masa both skidded to a halt, freezing in place. Neither moved a muscle. The drone hovered over them, scanning for any remaining motion. Masa stood completely still, his body drenched in sweat and fear, as the drone aimed directly at him. Then, the drone shifted its aim toward George. George remained calm, unmoving, though a single bead of sweat trickled down his face. The drone lingered for a moment longer, then ascended and slowly drifted away. Its system confirmed, target neutralized. The mission, as far as it was concerned, was complete. Still frozen, George and Masa waited until it disappeared from view. Only then did Masa collapse to the ground, crying in relief. He admitted through trembling breath that he thought it was over for him. George exhaled deeply and walked over, offering Masa a hand. As he helped him up, Masa asked again what that thing was. George explained that it was a drone developed in the Republic of Aldimir, designed specifically for tracking and indiscriminate killing. He added that it was so defective it couldn't distinguish enemies from allies, which is why it had been retired from military use long ago. Masa was horrified to hear that such a thing had ever been used in real warfare. He looked at George with disbelief and remarked that he seemed to know a lot about it. George didn't answer immediately. Instead, he muttered aloud, wondering why the crazy chaser was here, of all places. He recalled how dangerous it had been, so dangerous that selling or lending it to foreign nations had been strictly forbidden. And yet, here it was, chasing laborers like game. A cold realization began to form in his mind. Looking off toward the horizon, George questioned to himself whether this island might somehow be connected to the Aldimir military he once served in.
Later that night, beneath the bright moonlight, George returned home. He opened the door quietly and stepped inside. Kyo was standing near the stove, cooking something. The moment he saw George, he called out to him, using his old name, Michio. Kyo then remarked that George had taken quite a while to return that day. From the corner of the room, Kyo's mother, still lying on her bed, lightly scolded the boy, telling him that he should say "welcome back home" first before asking anything else. George, meanwhile, glanced at the pot and wondered what Kyo was cooking. Kyo reacted with mock indignation, asking George if he had forgotten about it too. He reminded George that it was his own specialty dish, one George used to love back when he was still Michio, though Kyo himself had no idea about that connection. The food, however, didn't look appealing. In fact, just a glance told George that it was well below average in quality. But Kyo was thrilled, proudly declaring that now they could afford such fancy leftovers, and he thanked George for that. Kyo genuinely appreciated the moment. As he filled a bowl with his concoction, George silently questioned the idea of calling it fancy leftovers. A few minutes later, George, Kyo, and Kyo's mother sat together, ready to eat. Kyo looked excited as the aroma wafted toward him, believing it smelled amazing. But George remained silent as he stared at the food. He eventually took a bite and instantly noticed how intensely sour it was. He silently questioned whether it was even safe for human consumption. Compared to this, he thought, even military rations were better. Meanwhile, Kyo was eating enthusiastically, completely immersed in the joy of the meal. George looked at him shocked. His eyes widened as he wondered what kind of taste buds Kyo must have to enjoy something like this. At that moment, Kyo's mother leaned in and quietly told George that even buying leftovers was tough on the island. She added that she had grown up eating far worse food as a child. As Kyo continued eating, he bit into something squishy and smiled. It was an earthworm. He chewed it with delight. His mother's expression turned somber, while George sat beside her, listening in silence. Kyo suddenly called out to George and pointed to his food, announcing that there was still meat on the bone. He was ecstatic, feeling as though he had hit the jackpot that day. George, still silent, simply kept watching him. Kyo finished his meal with satisfaction. Then he raised his hand toward George and asked him to fork something over. George, puzzled, asked what he meant. Kyo yelled at him not to play dumb and demanded the food money. Then he asked George whether he had received his wages. George, still eating, calmly responded that the money was already gone. He had given it to Masa. Kyo was stunned. George continued, saying that from now on, he intended to give all his wages to Masa. That statement enraged Kyo. He stood up abruptly, yelling at George. In his frustration, Kyo accidentally kicked the table, knocking over one of the bowls and spilling stew onto the floor. Pointing at the mess, Kyo shouted that it was George's fault, that he had spilled the stew. But George simply continued eating, unbothered. Kyo stared at the fallen food in disbelief. There was some stew left in the bowl on the ground. On the other side of the table, George quietly finished his meal. Getting up, George told Kyo that he had a good use for the leftovers. Then he instructed the boy to take them and follow him. Kyo hesitated for a moment, but eventually complied. Some time later, the two arrived in a nearby forest. George knelt down and opened the basket containing the leftover food. Kyo watched, confused, wondering what George was planning to do. Without saying anything at first, George dropped some of the food onto the ground. Kyo asked why he was doing that, and then shouted in protest, believing George was disrespecting his cooking. Remaining calm, George clarified that he wasn't trashing Kyo's cooking and told him not to get loud over every little thing. As he adjusted the basket into position, George explained that he was repurposing the leftovers. He then began setting a trap using the food and told Kyo that leftovers with a strong stench made for gourmet bait, perfect for luring wild animals. In other words, it was enough to draw something out. Kyo realized that George was setting a trap. He asked what they were trying to catch. George replied that they'd probably catch rats or other small animals. Kyo was taken aback and asked whether George was really okay with eating rats. He added that he had once heard of people dying from stomach issues after eating them. While walking away,
George told him that sewer rats in the city were indeed disease carriers, but forest rats were a valuable source of protein. Then George turned to Kyo and asked if he didn't like rats. If not, he suggested they go on a bit more of a walk. As they walked through thick bushes, Kyo asked whether they were going to set more traps. George answered by asking why they shouldn't, especially in such overgrown brush. He explained that it was exactly because it was overgrown that it worked. The animals felt safe coming closer. Just then, George's eyes lit up as he saw something ahead. He told Kyo that the animals would come when they felt safe. Kyo's eyes widened as he spotted it too. A large bird had fallen into the trap. Its neck was caught by a rope, its beak still trying to reach the earthworm used as bait. George asked Kyo if that would be enough to cover their dinner for the night. Amazed and overjoyed, Kyo nodded in agreement. The scene shifted to the mining site's administration building. Inside, Deputy Director Ueshima was presenting this week's report to Director Akechi. He reported that the week's mining total had reached 643.72 tons and added, with a hint of concern, that 9 slaves had died. Most of them, he believed, likely had succumbed to malnutrition or overwork. Ueshima then hesitated before suggesting that even if they were slaves, life was still life. He asked Akechi whether we should increase food portions or allow more breaks. Akechi simply smirked. While reclining in his chair, he flung the report papers into the air with a flick of his wrist. His voice turned cold as he stated that the head office didn't care about human life. Ueshima tried to speak again, but Akechi silenced him, warning him not to make him repeat himself. He continued, saying that as long as the mining output increased, his personal evaluation would go up, and that would help him rise faster through the ranks at HQ. His expression darkened as he leaned forward and declared that he didn't want to stay on that filthy garbage island forever. He didn't care how many slaves broke down. They would simply use them up. To him, mining took priority. Ueshima, stunned by Akechi's words and his expression, found himself too shocked to respond. He quietly nodded in agreement. Akechi then called for the next report. Another man stepped forward and reported that the wages totaled 2.8 million yen, while goods sold amounted to 2,523,200 yen. The recovery rate was negative, down 90%. He sneered as he mentioned that the workers were once again spending their earnings foolishly, eating and drinking like idiots. Still lounging in his chair, Akechi adjusted his glasses and remarked that they were just chasing the carrot dangled in front of them, trapped just like animals. In his eyes, the workers were no smarter than beasts. He then asked if there were any additional reports. Another man spoke up, saying that he had heard number 8 from Team G was aiming for the Paraiso Pass. The others in the room burst into laughter. They scoffed at the idea of a mere worker saving up 1 million yen. But Akechi's expression turned cold. His lips curled into an ominous smile as he muttered darkly, "Number 8 of G."
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. Hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest uploads. See you in the next one. Take care.